professor at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia in the United States. I'm associate professor of media studies and production in our College of Media and Communication. But what I'm going to talk about today is my work on video games specifically, an ongoing project I've had creating the LGBTQ game archive, as well as the Rainbow Arcade, which is currently at the Schwules Museum and closing today. So if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, you have until 7 p.m. tonight to do so. I probably most well known for my book Gaming at the Edge, which came out in 2014, which is looking at gender, race, and sexuality in video games from an audience perspective. It's based on doing interviews with people who are members of marginalized groups who play games about their feelings about and relationships with representation in digital games. And then in 2017, Bonnie Ruberg and I co-edited a collection called Queer Game Studies, which was attempting to do a snapshot of the burgeoning area of queer game studies, which has since exploded, mostly focused on questions of representation, but also thinking about how queer theory can be used to rethink digital game studies. Since 2015, though, my main research project has been the LGBTQ video game archive, which is available online for free. We also have a Facebook page and a Twitter that is a little less active. This is part of a project to document all LGBTQ content in all digital games, currently dating back to the 1970s. Today I'm going to talk specifically about what it means and the work of doing this kind of research in public, as opposed to just doing sort of traditional academic work where I do research in my office, publish it in paywalled journals, and then go on with my life. The archive, the scholarship that comes out of it, as well as the exhibit, are trying to make this kind of research available openly so that people can do what they want with it, rather than something just used to build my academic profile. There are a lot of people to thank. I won't name all of them. They are all listed on the archive homepage. This research has been sponsored both by my home college as well as our Digital Scholarship Center, Refiguring Innovation in Games, which is a feminist game studies organization at York University in Canada, currently moving to the University of British Columbia. And then obviously the Schwules Museum exhibit was sponsored by the Berlin Senate Department for Culture in Europe, the Computer Schwules Museum, and then a long list of media partners. I also, if you notice when I talk about this project and when you look on the archive website, I use we a lot, and that's because it is both my work as well as an ongoing list of research assistants I'm assigned through my university, people I can afford to pay through grants, and a lot of volunteers who volunteer to do one entry on one game at a time. So I don't think that I need to use this slide necessarily with this group, but I usually start the talk on this research with there's LGBTQ content in video games, exclamation point, because that's usually what people say when I tell them what I do. The short answer is yes. People are usually happy with that as an answer, so I usually throw some numbers at them. The current master list of games for the archive is over 1,200, and this slide changes every single time I give this presentation. Every time we do research on games, we either find more games that hadn't already been listed, people send us games, and obviously new games come out. I also want to point out that while there is an increasing amount over time, I also want to emphasize that the sheer number of games has increased exponentially over that same amount of time. So we can't really speak to what this represents in terms of percentage of games writ large. That's not data that's actually available to us, but there has been an increase, and it's sort of tracked along with the increase of games more generally. Yes, the numbers changed. And while there's a lot of, an increasing amount of books on the history of games as an industry and a popular culture phenomenon, there actually is very little research on the history of LGBTQ representation. In fact, the Rainbow Arcade catalog, which we published through a Kickstarter, which I'll talk about a bit later, is the first book form of a history of LGBTQ video game content. There are two books, Gender Inclusive Game Design and Sex in Video Games, that do both sex and gender historically, but in both cases they're focused very much on cisgender representation and heterosexuality. Sex in Video Games really doesn't mention much homosexuality or bisexuality at all. On the other hand, and this is the other area of my research, there is a long history of doing historical research on LGBTQ representation in all other types of media. These are very US-centric examples, but from news to television to advertising to film, there's a long history of documenting this history, and it doesn't exist for games. And that's a large part of why I created the archive project in the first place. One, so that somebody could write that history. I had done a sort of mini project in 2007 where I made a list of games with LGBTQ content, but my focus was on interviewing people who worked in the industry, and my work after that was focused on people who are players. I figured somebody else would do the textual analysis historical approach at some point, and after 10 years nobody had done it, so I decided I might as well do it, since I had the time and resources. I also made this public and wanted it to be sort of a public project, at least in terms of making the research available to people, because as Bob Skiba, who is a curator at the William Way Center in Philadelphia, says, we need to be the stewards of our own history. That is, it is important for LGBTQ people to start documenting those histories that have so far been lost to the video game industry. Most of the industry histories tend to focus on a select number of companies and designers, not thinking about sort of the global game industry. For example, it's very Japan and US centric. To a certain extent, the UK is covered. But also topics of representation, LGBTQ people working and living in these fields are not well documented in games history. I'll go kind of quickly through this step by step. As I said, this started as a list of 51 games I made for a project in 2007 where I interviewed people who worked in the game industry, either on games with LGBT content or not, about why there wasn't more content in LGBTQ content in digital games, given the explosion of content in other types of media. I then added to that list, going through both the Wikipedia list of LGBTQ characters, which was very valuable, a lot of sort of top LGBTQ character lists from various websites, and then we partnered with Queerly Represent Me, who went public the exact same month as we did, doing a very similar project, though theirs was based on a survey. So for Queerly Represent Me, they do a survey of people who play video games and ask them to enter in games they know of with LGBTQ content. So since 2016, we've been sharing our master list, which is also what's helped us grow quite a bit. This is just a small fraction of our master archive list, where we list every single game, every instance of content, whether that be a character or a storyline or a one-off joke that happens somewhere, and then we go through and research each individual one of those examples. Each game, there are 1,200 on the master list, but each game takes between 5 and 80 hours to research. And that's because we go through all the information we can about the game to sort of learn what we can about this character, these characters or these examples, what it is that put these games on the sort of Wikipedia master list of LGBTQ content, for example. So as one case in point, It Came from the Desert from 1989 was on the Wikipedia master list as having, the player encounters Jackie, a lesbian girl who crashed her car with her girlfriend, right? That's all the information we started with or had to go on. Doing a little research, we found a Tumblr of lists of lesbian characters in video games, and we find this, a minor character, couldn't find her name. This game was set in 1951. That's all the information we had to go on. So keep digging, find a walkthrough and a wiki about the game, find all a list of characters, and we find Jackie, but the only thing we find out about Jackie is that she left her boyfriend, who was a mobster, to drive out to the desert, was in a car accident, and then her friend had disappeared. So ultimately, in the middle of the night, while doing this research, I find a long play video where somebody has just sat through and played the game from start to finish without any commentary, so I can just sit and watch it. It was an hour and 10 minutes, and this was at 2 in the morning. So I watched this game, trying to find who Jackie is and why it is that somebody listed her on the Wikipedia master list as being a lesbian. And what I ultimately find is this scene. It's the only scene where she mentions girlfriend, and she says, I was asleep in the backseat of the car when all of a sudden my girlfriend screams and I hear the car hit something and go off the road. I must have stuck my head on the back of the seat or something, because next thing I wake up and my girlfriend's gone and the car's stuck in the sand and we got to do something. The spoiler alert, it's a game from 1989, so I don't think you have to worry about spoilers. It's giant ants that resulted in the car crash. Girlfriend, never seen again. But more specifically, and this is something that I find interesting when I do have presented this in various places, girlfriend here, at least at this particular point in time, when the game was made, and the cultural context in which it's made, is platonic. It is, this is my lady who is also my friend, right? Girlfriend not meaning romantic partner. But somebody somewhere saw this one-off, said she has a girlfriend, therefore she's a lesbian. Despite the fact that she's running away from her ex-boyfriend, despite the fact that she ends up sleeping with the male protagonist through one storyline, nobody bothered to call her bisexual in any of the way they list her, right? But they see girlfriend and list her as that way. We do this for every game. All 1,200 games, which is why we're not done with all 1,200 yet. We're close to about 400 being completed. Similarly, that's just one example. That is one game that had one character in it, right? There are other games that have a lot more content, especially when you're talking about game series published over many, many years. The one game series so far that has by far the most LGBTQ content in it that most people are surprised by is Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto has by far the most LGBTQ content in it. Not all good and not all bad, as you might expect. But it comes in the form of every type of LGBTQ representation that we've documented. It is characters who are major characters, minor characters, one-off characters in the background, characters who merely appear in databases of people who are arrested by the police in the specific game, people you never see, people in media produced that you just happen to hear if you turn on the radio in the car, people who just happen to appear on TV shows if you sit long enough in front of one of the TVs in the game, right? It is, well, you know, we could spend all day talking about the oppressiveness of a lot of the content in the series. They also have by far the most diverse cast of LGBTQ characters. If you look at most media franchises, right, they don't have quite as much racial or class diversity as the Grand Theft Auto series does. And I'm not saying that they do it right, but I am saying that for a game company that is actively trying not to be progressive and inclusive, they're managing to do a lot more diversity of representation than people who are. And so I think that it's worth thinking about why is that? Why is a company who's actively trying to be offensive can offer so much diversity of LGBTQ characters? They also find ways of including those characters across, and again, these are obviously meant to be offensive, right? And yet, somebody thought it was worth making background ads or names of businesses or one-off references. I won't play the video, but this is two people burying somebody in a desert talking about somebody they used to know who now apparently is gay, right? That's 30 seconds in hundreds of hours of gameplay, but it's there, right? It's included throughout the universe. This is a universe in which gay people are just taken for granted as existing, right? When it comes to the LGBTQ game archive, we do include all forms of representation. So we do characters, obviously. That's sort of the main thing that people document and ends up on all of those lists of LGBTQ content. Relationship and romance options being the second one that most people document and pay attention to. But also actions. A lot of these lists that try to document LGBTQ content in video games list things like cross-dressing, right? Or special moves. A character I'll show in a minute called Rasputin has a secret garden move where he only pulls other male opponents into a bush and then parts emanate from it. A final finishing move in a fighting game, right? There are locations, there are gay bars that just happen to be in these game worlds, artifacts, sort of narratives that either major or minor, in most cases relatively minor, but they're there, right? And one thing that I've been tracking, that I've been working on tracking more is homophobia and transphobia. We tend to look at LGBTQ representation in terms of sort of positive existence of representation or games that have notable LGBTQ characters, but it's also worth documenting the history of homophobic and transphobic jokes or mentions or storylines in games as well. Obviously, because these are based on lists that other people have curated and because we can't go through and play every single game, the vast majority of the content on the archive is in the form of characters, over 70%. Second is obviously relationship, romance, and sex, but this is just from our quantification of 1985 to 2005. These other forms of representation pop up a bit more over time. I won't go through all of the numbers, but I just want to point out that this one goes across kinds of platforms. Often most of the games we've documented are cross-platform games. Very few in the handheld variety, but again, this is pre-2005, so there are just sort of fewer of those games. A lot of them are from Japan and the United States and the UK. The rest of the world content is what is other, and that's just because there were so few from each of the individual countries. But again, this I think is as much much an artifact of who's making the lists of these games as where and when this content is actually being produced. As sort of expected, the vast majority of these characters are gay, cisgendered men, very few trans characters, very few bisexual, asexual, or lesbian characters. Most of the characters are also white characters. There are actually very few characters of color, either in terms of sexuality or in terms of gender. And then when it comes to role in the game, this is from one study that is publicly available. The explicitness of sexuality had much more to do with the character's role in the game, so whether or not they were an enemy or a player character. The explicitness of sexuality tends to be focused on non-player characters as opposed to player characters or enemies. Similarly, the race of characters and their role in the game and where the country is from. So Japan has many more playable LGBTQ characters, whereas in the US and UK it's much more the non-player characters. As part of this project, I've made a commitment to making all of the research that I can available publicly. Now that I have tenure, I can do that. So all of the quantified research and the research that has sort of documented the creation of the archive is in the International Journal of Communication. There are a couple other chapters, one on Grand Theft Auto and one on Leisure Suit Larry, that are not publicly available, but you can just send me an email and I will send you a PDF if you're curious about those things. But moving forward, we're publishing all of the research out of this in open access journals as much as possible. We also invite people, if they want to do their own research using our database. So we have the sort of public-facing archive that people can access and find all the information they want about individual characters. But we also have been giving the underlying database that we use to code characters to anybody who asks for it to do their own research. So Facia is a Brazilian game company who did one project for a Brazilian game conference. And then Cody Major is a former grad student, just finished his doctorate at Michigan State University, who also did a data visualization based on our archive. We also, one of the secondary goals of making this research public is it also makes the research better, because people tend to send us games that we otherwise don't have access to. Usually people send us their own games and then we ask them to write up their own entry about it because it gets it up faster. As I said, we have 1,200 games, so it takes a while to get through them. That this allows us to make the research better, because so far all we're able to document is what people have already documented. The longer this site is up, the more people send us games that nobody had remembered or hadn't ended up on existing lists. For example, one of the things that came up very early on in this project is that there was about a 2-decade gap between indie games like Caper and the Castro and Gay Blade from 89 and 92 respectively, to 2012 when you see this burgeoning queer games indie movement with work by people like Anna Anthropy and Mary Kopis and Maddie Bryce. In the decades between, one answer is sort of the production and distribution of games changed, but also a lot of the indie games produced before sort of the 2012 explosion of them just weren't documented. As a case in point, because of the publicness of the archive, somebody sent us in this game, Fubar versus the DEA, which came out in 1996. Nobody had written about that game before. And thanks to the Wayback Machine, thanks to Twitter and sending out requests and requests and requests to get more information about this game, we finally got the full backstory of this game from one of the designers, right, who emailed us and told us the story of it. And then that enabled us to backtrack and find more information about the game, including the original files that had been posted somewhere to some early Mac games archive, right? And that every time we do this project, every time we do research, every time we go back, we find more of these examples. So it's also, it allows us to sort of be more generative rather than taking a master list and going through it in sort of a traditional academic style. In addition, one of the things that I found particularly interesting and I have no answers to is that there's no representation of HIV and AIDS in the games from the 1980s and 1990s. Despite the fact that if you look at any other popular media during that time, that was a dominant type of representation. And we could spend all day talking about why that might be and why that could possibly be, and maybe there are examples, but I have to say, every time I've posed this to other people who were active in games during that time, their answer is, but there must have been, right? And that's actually a really hard historical question, because everybody's certain that there must have been something, but nobody has a record of it, right? And how do we get at those records that we're sure must exist somewhere, but we just don't know where? A related problem, and a secondary part of this project, is we're very reliant on things people have posted to the internet, but as you might be aware, digital content gets taken down all the time. People cancel their YouTube channels. Gaygamer.net was sort of a massive resource for us, but in, I think it was 2016, the website went dark because the person who owned the domain shut it down, and nobody has access to the archive anymore because he stopped answering his emails. So that is a massive amount of data we could have had on LGBTQ games from the mid-2000s up to 2015 that's just gone now, right? We've done what we can to sort of piece together some things from the Internet Archive, but because it's not a heavily trafficked site, it's not fully archived like other sites are. In addition, the games themselves are lost, right? Ryan Best, who created Game Blade, for example, didn't have the original game files. He finally found them, but they're not in a playable form, right? So a lot of these games from pre-2000s even if we know they exist, we can't actually get access to the original files in the way we can much more popular games from those eras. So a secondary part of this project has been also saving all of that information, saving all of the screenshots, saving all of the gameplay videos, saving all of the news sites and wikis and fan pages, so that they can be, and one of my research assistants wrote a script to sort of scrape those things as much as possible from the internet so we can store it at the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, so that people can continue to do this research, right? Because as soon as everything that is written about the games is gone, the harder it is for us to understand what these games look like, outside of a one-off line on a Wikipedia page saying, I think there was a lesbian in this game once, right? And then the exhibit, which, how many of you have been to Rainbow Arcade? Few people. Today's your last chance. Just saying. I'm literally, some of that stuff is my own personal stuff. Like there's a Gone Home t-shirt that's my personal Gone Home t-shirt, and so I'm taking all of it home tomorrow, so it's literally your last chance. The exhibit is part of a different project, which is trying to bring what is academic research into conversation with sort of public archiving and exhibit projects. It is, the story of how this exhibit came to be here and how it came to be at the Schwules is literally the fact that my archive was public online and had an email address so people could contact us. So Jan, who worked at the museum, emailed the email account. If you email the archive account, it just goes to me. I'm the only person who answers it, right? That just happened to happen. It said, are you interested in collaborating, or at least allowing us to use what you've already put online? That's how it ended up here. That's all the story is, right? Is an email connection made possible by putting research publicly available online in the first place, right? So that had I kept this research sort of quiet to myself, which is a very academic approach, it wouldn't have been able to inform an exhibit. It wouldn't have been able to turn into what it did, which is a Kickstarter-funded book, which is the first book on the history of LGBTQ content in games, right? So I think not just in the yay, it's good for me because I got a book out there, right, sense, but that it is better to have made this research published so that it can inform this kind of project. For those of you who haven't been at Rainbow Arcade, we sort of start with an overview of the exhibit and sort of queer gaming history. We have a sort of section that goes through historical firsts, but we emphasize that these are potential firsts. As I said, these are things that are constantly being rediscovered or uncovered, or things that people hadn't found before. So questioning this idea that we could ever really know what the first of any kind of representation in games is. We then have a section on mainstream developers, both sort of stories people might be familiar with, but also questioning this common refrain that there are no LGBTQ people in the mainstream game industry. It's not true, and it never has been true, right? But it's something that is constantly said, and therefore makes it harder for people to imagine themselves in the industry, which is part of why we profiled specific designers like on the wall so that people could see themselves in this industry, but also pointing to problems in the industry, right? Problems that are specific to certain kinds of game companies, certain trends in representation, as well as talking about indie games, both in the vein of thinking about specific game designers, but also the fact that there are what we might call indie companies, smaller companies. There's no sort of singular divide between what we might consider mainstream and what we might consider independent, right? It's a spectrum of industries, which is part of why we put these two sections together. But also pointing out that the kind of funding you get, the kind of support you get changes the kinds of representation you can make possible. And then one of my favorite sections is a section on LGBTQ gaming communities. This is actually, a lot of this is based on some of the first work I did on LGBTQ game studies back in 2005, which is talking with people who are members of smaller LGBTQ gaming communities, thinking through their role in sort of demanding or asking for LGBTQ representation, but also the ways that they make do with representation that they have available to them. And then obviously having a section on discrimination was important, but we wanted to sort of make it smaller. We didn't want that to dominate what the history of LGBTQ content in the space is. There are also a series of videos that are at the archive, but are also available online now that we collaborated with Feminist Frequency, which is a US educational nonprofit, on, that was written by my former RA, who now works at Microsoft Research and then is starting grad school in the fall. That sort of is a popular summary of some of the research we've done going into the LGBTQ game archive. And then the hardest section is the next level section. This is the section that our designer hated because every couple of weeks we wanted to add something to it because things keep happening, right? Should this, we have hopes to make this a traveling exhibit, and if it does, this is probably the section that's gonna change the most, because every time we think, oh, this is a new cool thing, something else new and cool happens, and then we keep adding to it. But it's trying to imagine both from an industry perspective, from a design perspective, from a community perspective, what do queer gaming futures look like, right? And in some answers, in some sections, we have asked the people who are profiled in the exhibit what they think, but also we leave it up to the people who would visit the exhibit itself to try to make sense of what should it be, what could it look like, right? Are we just imagining a future of more realistic games, or thinking about Zoya Street's interactive portraits of transgender people in Japan? Can we also think about old school, very, simple graphics as also being an important form of representation? Zoya designed that specifically so that they're not realistic, so people aren't being represented in a sort of voyeuristic way, but representing what they're saying in a much more pictorial way. Also, I said this at the opening of the exhibit, and we'll mention it again tonight at the finissage, but the Rainbow Arcade is literally my CV. It is literally everything I've done over the last 15 years put into one very, very colorful room. So if you have any questions about my work in general, I do recommend just going. It's all there, quite literally. But also if you are interested in more detail in any of the topics you've seen there, I'm also happy to give you access to these things. And I highlighted and wanted to highlight sort of the work that goes into the archive, because that's also what makes things like this exhibit possible in the first place. Like, having a documentation of that history is the only way in which we can have exhibits so people can see what this representation has looked like over time, right? And it is sort of a question or a challenge or an ask of you as people who work in the game industry to be more attentive to how you save things for the future. Because it's actually one of the most difficult things about doing historical game research is that people don't keep things. And people don't keep things for a variety of reasons, but that it's actually really important because otherwise we can't, we won't be able to tell your history if you don't save things, right? And so summarizing, there is LGBTQ content in games. You seem to be aware of that, which I appreciate. But one thing is the trends in representation aren't actually sort of as reflective of representation in other media as we might assume. It doesn't track the same way we see in other popular media. It's not just clearly coded characters or same-sex relationship options, and it's also not as universally negative as one might expect. I do find that when I go to the exhibit, people sort of hone in on this discrimination section, which I understand why it's the cooler blue section, and it's calming in a way. That is what I heard one person say. And it's the easiest takeaways, but there's so much more complexity to representation, which is what we try to capture in the rest of the exhibit. And that very specifically, it has a very long history, right? It's since the 1980s. Actually, one of our earliest examples is now a role-playing game from the 1970s. That's older than me, right? This representation is older than me. And therefore, that's a pretty substantive history to sort of build future representation on. And then, as I said, finding this history is very difficult. And the only way we can find it better is if people are better at documenting it, but also sharing what they have and what they've documented. And I will leave it there. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. How much time should I leave for questions? Or?
Depends on the number of questions.
Okay.
We have time.
We have time.
You're looking for volunteers to help sort through those 1,200 games?
Always looking for volunteers. The best way is to go to the contact page on the LGBTQ Game Archive, and I or somebody will send you a list of what we request.
You had mods as one of the things that you listed in what you looked through. There are so many mods for so many games. How do you deal with that? I mean, it seems that it's like they're not counted.
Yes, I mean, so the way I've approached this project in general is being as all-encompassing and inclusive as I can. So if people have named a specific mod on one of the lists we draw upon, we write up that one. We haven't yet had the time or resources to go through like each individual game and sort of document each mod. But a lot of it has been sort of, somebody says, have you looked at this mod? That's when we start. And so in some cases there are games like Fallout 4 is a good example, where there are tons, and it's on our list to go back to, but it is sort of a long-term goal to be able to at least point to an archive of the mods and say these are the kinds of mods that people have made for this specific game, at the very least. Given the amount of work it would be to document what is in each and every individual one.
I didn't see too many references to any references to mobile games during your presentation. Is that an area you're interested in expanding to more?
Absolutely, and a lot of this is because the games that we've sort of quantified and finished more or less, even though we keep finding more, is up to 2005. And there aren't any games on our list for phones from up to that point that we've had. There are some handheld games, but very few of those. Moving forward, we do have more mobile games on our lists from 2005 to present, some of which have been documented, some of which haven't. But we're always looking to add more games.
It's interesting because in some of the mobile games I've been looking at recently, I feel like they do a better job than almost any other game I've seen in different kinds of representation. So I feel like in that respect, mobile games are on a kind of job.
Absolutely. And do you know names of specific ones?
I do.
Maybe I should ask you to send those to me later so I can yes, and I think that that's a project looking forward is sort of, we did the big quantified version because those numbers just didn't exist, but I do want to look more at like how different platforms of games treat representation differently and what that says about what different types of platforms enable, but also the companies that make them, how those enable different kinds of representation.
Yeah, so thank you for making all this information public. That's really cool. And I'm curious how audiences have taken the archived information and used it or interpreted it in interesting ways.
I mean, I think one of the more interesting examples is actually, it came from the desert. When I was doing the research, it was on the Wikipedia list. But since we wrote up the entry sort of explaining why it's a questionable example of whether or not that was how that character was meant to be read, it was given as evidence for why it was taken off the list. I think there are also a lot of people who point to it, especially because we do document queer readings of characters and sort of shipping of characters. Not necessarily, we don't document fan fiction as that's sort of a bigger secondary project, but we do document sort of histories of fan communities reading characters as in relationships. And increasingly we've seen some of the forums we use for research pointing back to us as evidence for how people have read characters. I think that's one of the more interesting things I've seen. But also, one of the things that I found rather amazing is when I made it public, I was sort of very prepared for hate mail. I made a little folder in our Gmail account for hate mail specifically, and we've never gotten any. right? In 3 years of being public. I mean, and considering that when we made it public, I was getting a lot of harassment personally, I was kind of prepared for that to be a very big reaction, and it hasn't been. The only thing we've gotten is fan mail or volunteers. So I think it's also, and I don't know why that is, and I'm not going to question it. I'm not requesting harassment, but I think it's interesting that people have only used it as sort of a positive resource and not used it as something to critique necessarily, which I don't know why, but I like it.
So you mentioned a role-playing game in the 70s. Could you say more?
Oh, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I believe the title had bunnies in it. We do because of our partnership with Queerly Represent Me, have started listing pen and paper role-playing games on our master list as well, but we haven't researched all of them yet. And most of that is just the research assistants I've had are more experts in digital game cultures and histories, and so a lot of the older ones that we've been adding to the list are actually those sorts of tabletop role-playing games rather than digital role-playing games. So I can't tell you more about the details of it.
So there have been a lot of games in the recent past that have given the player the opportunity to choose the player character's sexuality. How do you catalog those instances?
In those instances, so there are two different things. One, if it is a game where the player characters doesn't have any other sort of backstory, that it's very much just player driven, and the non-player characters they can romance are clearly set up to romance the player character regardless of their choice. We list that as optional relationships rather than counting them towards the list of characters. However, increasingly, especially with the BioWare games, the non-player characters are also coded with the sexuality, so we've made that a secondary form of representation. So those characters, if there's a way for us to access that there's an intended sexual preference coded into that character, right? We document those as counting towards the character list, but otherwise optional romances and optional sex have been sort of its own category of representation. And one of the ones that becomes increasingly harder to research as people do start to make the non-player characters more developed and advanced, which is not something I'm complaining about. It just makes it harder to write the individual entries. I think fortunately, the Mass Effect entry was written by somebody doing their dissertation on romance options in Mass Effect, which is why it is so detailed and it's basically like a romance chart between all of them. And that's increasingly something that we're going to have to do with BioWare games in particular. Other questions? I do have, I believe in my bag, cards for the archive if you just want the web address very easily accessible, or you can always email me individually. I have those cards as well. I used to have stickers, but I ran out, I'm sorry. one, have to distinguish between games produced by companies and games produced by individuals a bit more. But also that is probably where we'll see most of the difference. I'll say the vast majority of the content is sort of incidental, one-off NPC characters you might run into.
Right, it seems to be like that'll shift with a tabletop, we've got Monster Hearts, where it's the game is specifically about queer culture, as opposed to you can be.
Exactly. I mean, Caper and the Caster and Beyblade and Fubar versus the D-Game are all the sort of pre-2000 indie games we've found so far, and all three of those, it is the main game, but the vast majority of the rest is just background.
Thanks so much.
Yes, sure.
Have a good trip back.
Thanks.
I just wanted to say thanks for, I really enjoyed reading your stuff because when I was studying, which was only a few years ago, I was doing a master's and there's so many really straight takes on everything. It was really nice to read from a different side. I'm not queer identifying, but I really enjoyed reading something that wasn't every other. So especially the Digger article was, thank you. Gave me hope for this discipline.
Thank you so much. Can I have the cards?
Yeah, sure.
And then I'll just put them close to the entrance. Yeah.
So I distribute the
As many as you can spare. We've got some lunch, okay? So, I should my colleagues to say something. Because I know why people here.
It's for one project I worked with a game company called First Playable in Troy, New York, and they regularly had just food out constantly because it would never stay around otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. We usually have these don't touch this